Nearly 6 decades ago, deep in the peaceful evergreen forests of Colorado, 3 people vanished in a single night: a father and daughter, a newborn baby, and a mysterious young man, all disappearing at the same moment. No goodbyes, no cries for help, just a locked cabin, a car abandoned on a mountain road, and scattered clues that seemed to defy every rule of investigation. Police were left standing between 3 separate scenes that refused to connect into one coherent picture. A desperate family waited for news, a small town sank into fear, and one sole suspect, Daniel Whitmore, vanished into thin air, leaving behind a question that would haunt the entire community for more than half a century. What really happened on those dark pine-lined roads? For decades the case lay buried in the cold case archives, seemingly never to be solved. But then, as forensic science entered a new era, a tiny piece of clothing that had sat silent in a steel locker for 55 years finally began to speak. A clue once thought useless suddenly became the key that unlocked a chain of horrifying events, and as investigators followed what little remained of the past, they uncovered a truth that went far beyond every initial assumption. Before we dive deep into this tragic and mysterious journey, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love cold cases being re-examined with modern science, don't forget to hit subscribe to support the channel. The mountain town nestled at the foot of the Rockies was unusually quiet one early morning. The air still carried the chill of the night before, thin as a layer of mist that didn't want to leave the pavement. At the end of the slope leading to the Pinecrest neighborhood, the only light still on in Harold Dempsey's house had just gone out. Around 5 in the morning, Harold, a 56-year-old man who stuck religiously to routine, pushed open the front door, straightened his jacket collar, and motioned for Lydia, his adopted daughter, to follow. The roughly 20-year-old woman closed the wooden door behind her, carrying a small sketchbook and a neatly folded cardigan. A neighbor standing in the next yard with a fresh milk jug watched them pull out of the driveway in the dim dawn light and nodded hello. Harold's Ford rolled up the steep road and disappeared into the silver mist toward Bear Creek Canyon, and that was the last time anyone in the neighborhood ever saw them. Not far away, down a dirt road that wound into the pine forest, the Whitmore family's small cabin sat in thick darkness. The night before, a neighbor had noticed the cabin lights staying on later than usual, flickering as if someone were pacing inside. There were no loud noises, no signs of an argument, just a strange unplaceable feeling, as though something had quietly shifted behind those log walls. Inside the Whitmore house, Margaret lay awake until nearly dawn. It was long past the time her son Daniel was supposed to bring little Benjamin, her months-old grandson, back home after babysitting. Every previous time Daniel had returned the baby before midnight, but this night there was no car in the yard, no familiar knock, and the kitchen wall phone stayed silent. Near dawn it suddenly rang. Daniel's voice came through the line, choked and hurried, broken by pauses that sounded like suppressed breathing. "Mom, don't come here," he said in one short sentence and hung up. No explanation, no mention of Benjamin, no hint of where he was. When Margaret called back, she got only an endless ring. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the misty yard, trying to make sense of those few words, growing more uneasy with every passing minute. At the same time, on the opposite side of town, the Dempsey family began realizing Harold and Lydia had not shown up at their planned meeting place. They were supposed to arrive around 7, but when the clock passed that mark, there was still no sign of them. Calls to the house went unanswered. Harold never ran late, and Lydia had never gone incommunicado when traveling. The silence was too complete, too unnatural. By 8 o'clock that morning, 2 families at opposite ends of town faced the same reality. No one, absolutely no one, knew where their loved ones were. And in that moment, when unanswered calls, empty cars, and locked doors began lining up into a pattern of wrongness, they were forced to do what no one in peaceful Evergreen ever thought they'd have to do on a quiet morning: pick up the phone and call the police. The call from the Dempsey family had barely ended when the Evergreen Police Department's duty room still echoed with the tense voice of the woman on the line. The shift supervisor hadn't even set the receiver down before the first report sheet was opened. 2 people left home before dawn, never arrived at their destination, unreachable. It sounded like a delayed trip, but the trembling voice of Marie Dempsey, a woman known for her calm, made it impossible to treat this as routine. Several officers nearby looked at each other as fragments of the conversation drifted over. Never late, mountain roads, still dark, no signal at all. That alone was enough to know this morning would not be quiet. But before they could even verify the first report, the phone rang again. This time the caller wasn't urgent. She was nearly hysterical. Margaret Whitmore. She spoke in broken sentences about how her son Daniel had taken baby Benjamin the previous evening and never returned. She'd only heard Daniel's voice on the phone while it was still half dark. But what he said wasn't normal. An officer had to remind her to breathe deeply so she could speak clearly. What she repeated most was, "He told me not to come here." It wasn't clear whether here meant the cabin, the forest road or somewhere else, but the way Daniel said it convinced her something was very wrong. 2 missing persons reports, from 2 completely unrelated families living on opposite sides of town, yet both falling within nearly the same time frame and carrying the same sense of unease. The shift supervisor began pulling information from both sides together, trying to see if the 2 scaps of paper could somehow overlap. One case, 2 adults leaving home before sunrise, the other a young man and an infant disappearing after nightfall. It was far too early to draw conclusions, but professional instinct told him these 2 reports could not be treated as entirely separate incidents. The first step by the book was to take detailed statements from both families. Marie said Harold always drove extremely carefully on mountain roads and Lydia had never missed an important appointment. They left while it was still dark, but expected to arrive quickly. No one in the family imagined anything could go wrong. Everything had been completely normal before they left. Margaret, on the other hand, painted a very different picture. Daniel hadn't come home as usual, his phone call made no sense, and taking baby Benjamin overnight without notice was something he had never done before. From the family's statements, police began constructing a last-seen timeline. For Harold and Lydia, a neighbor had watched them leave the driveway, giving police a clear initial direction of travel. For Daniel and Benjamin, no one had seen them leave the cabin. The only anchor point was Daniel's brief phone call. Daniel's timeline gap was far wider, making it much harder to pinpoint which way he went. With no time to waste, the shift supervisor pulled 2 patrol officers from break and told them to bring the paper map of the Evergreen area to the command desk. Everything was still done with paper, pencils and local knowledge. No electronic systems, no modern networks, just short-range walkie-talkies. Possible escape routes from town were marked with colored pins, red for the direction Harold likely took, blue for routes around the Whitmore cabin. The standard 1960s missing persons search protocol began. First check rest stops, passes and pine forest areas. 2 patrol teams were assigned, one to follow the road into Bear Creek Canyon, the other to the Whitmore cabin. The priority was to reach any location where the missing might appear as quickly as possible to minimize the chance of serious harm. As the 2 patrol cars started up and rolled out of headquarters through streets still wet with mist, all the police had were faint clues and unnameable gaps in time. None of them knew that the puzzle pieces they were chasing would lead to 3 separate crime scenes, scattered traces and a case that would later tie the name Evergreen to one of the longest-running mysteries in Colorado investigative history. But in that moment it was still seen only as 2 missing persons cases, and their job was simple: find the people who hadn't come home. From the initial information on both disappearances, he knew they couldn't search randomly. They needed a clear system. Evergreen was a small town, but the terrain was far more complicated than outsiders realized. Narrow mountain roads, pine forests that stretched deep into valleys, and countless trails only locals knew. That made the first few hours of a missing person search critical, and the need to be accurate from the very first step, all the more vital. Archer divided the search area into 2 main sectors. Sector 1, the road into Bear Creek Canyon, the route Harold and Lydia should have taken. The road was winding, steep, and often foggy in the early morning. One patrol team was tasked with checking every segment with broken guardrails, pull-offs or places a vehicle could skid off. They carried analog walkie-talkies and film cameras to document anything unusual before sunlight washed out details. Sector 2, Route 74, the main artery connecting Evergreen to more populated areas. This was the most likely the route Daniel would have taken if he left the cabin at night. Route 74 had several sharp curves and mandatory slow zones. Those were the spots police marked with red pins for priority checks. Archer reminded the team, don't ignore even the smallest piece of glass or skid mark. Sector 3, the pine forest immediately around the Whitmore cabin. This was the hardest area to search, thick trees and numerous small trails created by locals or hunters. The forest team carried compasses, high-powered flashlights, and detailed topographic maps. They had to mark every side trail they checked to avoid missing areas or doubling back. With the 3 sectors set, Archer returned to the table to unfold an even more detailed paper map. No GPS, no digital support, everything relied on experience. He circled high-risk zones, narrow ravines, trail intersections, places where the ground often shifted slightly after rain. He also marked spots where hunters and hikers commonly stopped, because those locations were most likely to show traces if someone had passed through. The command desk walkie-talkie crackled. The Bear Creek team reported, entering heavy fog section, light soil disturbance visible. Archer told them to preserve the scene untouched until backup arrived. Moments later, the Route 74 team reported skid marks at a curve and small pieces of glass at the road's edge. Archer noted it on the map in pencil, added another red pin, and ordered immediate photos before the light changed. From the forest side, the 3rd team reported reaching the Whitmore cabin and noting several points of interest: broken branches near the porch, fairly fresh tire tracks, pointing down the mountain on the dirt road. Archer immediately outlined that area in thick pencil. This could be the direction Daniel took, especially if he left the cabin in the agitated state. Margaret described, every walkie-talkie report, Archer pinned to the map like the first pieces of an incomplete picture. Colored pins began spreading across the 3 routes, forming a web around Evergreen. Police had not yet found anyone, no sign of Harold or Lydia in the canyon, no sign of their car on Route 74, and no sign of Daniel or baby Benjamin in the forest. But every small detail, tire tracks, broken glass fragments, skid marks, was something that could not be ignored. Archer gave the map one last look before dispatching an additional support team. In missing persons cases, time was the one thing they could never buy more of. Within hours, evidence could be blown away by wind, run over by other vehicles, or completely erased by morning sun. What he knew for certain, and what worried him, was that both disappearances happened the same night, in the same general area. Even without evidence linking them yet, the coincidence was enough for every officer to understand they were walking into an unpredictable search, where any discovery could be the first clue, or a complete dead end. But the mission remained simply to find people. At that point, no one was thinking of anything more horrific. Police still believed they were racing to find living people, and they still hoped that Harold, Lydia, Daniel, and little Benjamin were somewhere out there on the mountain roads around Evergreen, waiting to be found. The patrol team responsible for the pine forest reported they were only a few hundred meters from the Whitmore cabin, and Sergeant Archer immediately ordered them to slow down from this point forward. Everything related to Daniel, the man who vanished with a newborn baby, needed to be documented carefully. Although police were still treating this disappearance as separate from Harold and Lydia's case, the fresh tire tracks pressed into the dirt road, and the cabin's dead silence since last night, made this area a high-priority spot for thorough inspection. The road leading to the cabin was a narrow dirt path cutting straight through rows of pine trees, morning sunlight filtering through the gaps in the needles and casting jagged patches of light and shadow across the ground. As the patrol vehicle drew closer to the house, fine dust rose in the pale golden light, settling over the weathered wooden planks of the cabin. The team had silenced their siren long before to avoid disturbing the scene. When they stepped out, the air was so still they could almost hear the wind brushing against the pine needles. From the very first glance, the cabin felt wrong. On the front porch lay a few scattered items: a thin pillow blown askew by the wind, a small wooden chair tipped sideways near the step. It wasn't enough to prove a struggle, but it didn't look like a house someone had left normally either. One officer crouched to examine the ground near the porch steps, and spotted several small adult shoe prints pressed into the dry soil. There were no children's footprints, nor any of Benjamin's belongings anywhere on the front porch, making it even harder to guess where Daniel had taken the baby. The front door of the cabin was locked from the inside. That alone wasn't suspicious, but combined with everything else, lights staying on late the night before, Daniel's strange phone call, and the fact he never brought the baby home, it put the patrol team on high alert. They shouted Daniel's name and knocked several times to check if anyone was inside. No answer. Only a faint breeze whistled through the gaps in the wood, making the door tremble slightly. One officer circled the cabin to check the back. Beside the kitchen window, he found more tire tracks, clearer and sharper than those on the trail. It was easy to tell they'd been made in the last few hours. The soil hadn't fully dried, and the tread patterns were still crisp. This confirmed Daniel had driven away from the cabin in the dark or at dawn, but once again there was no way to determine which direction he took after leaving the property. While the team documented the cabin's condition, a neighbor who lived a few plots away, Warren Ellis, an older man who tended the northern land, walked over after hearing the police vehicle. Archer had given clear orders. Any side information could prove useful in the first hours, so the lead officer stopped to take his statement. Warren said that the night before he'd seen the cabin lights on much later than usual. Daniel didn't keep a strict schedule, but the place normally went dark after 10. Last night the side lights flickered like someone was pacing back and forth. When asked if he'd heard arguing or loud noises, Warren shook his head. No yelling, just felt. The information was immediately logged and relayed to Archer. The unusual lights in the cabin combined with the vague call Margaret received from Daniel a few hours later became the two most significant points tied to the disappearance. Though they didn't prove anything specific yet, they were enough to elevate the Whitmore cabin from just another checkpoint to the central focus of the entire pine forest search area. One officer continued circling the cabin and checking windows. Most were secured with wooden latches, but the kitchen window had a tiny gap that allowed a hazy view inside. Through the dust-frosted glass, he could see a chair toppled beside the dining table, and something that looked like a baby blanket draped crookedly over a chair. It wasn't clear if wind or someone had knocked it askew, but every detail was noted. The other two officers examined the small clearing behind the cabin, a sunken patch of ground with indistinct footprint. There were no signs of a struggle, but the slight disturbance in the soil suggested someone had stood there for a while. When the information reached command, Archer immediately outlined the cabin in thicker ink on the map. Priority level, thorough. The cabin was the last place Daniel was known to have been, and the locked door, displaced items, and unusual lights the night before were all indicators. This could be more serious than a routine missing persons case. Before leaving the cabin to check the connecting roads to Route 74, the team decided to fully document the layout with film photographs, the porch, the distance from the dirt road to the front door, and every tire track. They knew that if Daniel wasn't found quickly, these initial images and notes would become critically important. As they returned to their vehicles, no one said it out loud, but everyone felt the same thing. The Whitmore cabin wasn't just another stop on the search. It carried the traces of an event still hidden inside, something only time and the next steps of the search would reveal. The Route 74 patrol team stopped at a sharp curve after reporting they'd spotted something glinting on the pavement. The spot sat between two steep rock walls, not far from the road Harold and Lydia were believed to have taken. When the officers stepped out, they immediately recognized the flecks of light as shards of broken glass. There weren't many, just a few small pieces, but they were bright and clean, a clear sign they hadn't been there long. One officer crouched, picked up a piece with gloved fingers and held it to the sun. No dust, no wear, sharp edges. Everything pointed to the glass having fallen within the last few hours, the same window when Harold, Lydia, and Daniel had all been moving through the area. Right beside the glass, they found a long skid mark clearly etched into the asphalt. It curved with the bend in the road, and was darker than a normal braking mark. Sudden, as if the driver had slammed on the brakes to avoid an obstacle. Yet the skid ended at the edge of the pavement. It didn't continue down the slope. No broken guardrail, no torn-up earth, nothing typical of a vehicle losing control. A short distance away, another officer noticed a sharp tire swerve on the soft shoulder. The mark veered more aggressively than normal traffic, suggesting the vehicle had abruptly changed direction. But the ground there held moisture overnight, and took prints easily, so there was no way to pinpoint when the mark was made. Though it looked fresh, it couldn't yet be tied directly to any of the missing persons cases. The most notable, and most baffling detail was the complete absence of a vehicle at the scene. No car over the edge, none in the brush, no signs of impact with the embankment. The glass suggested a collision, but not one severe enough to leave major wreckage. That made this stretch of road an area of clear anomalies, yet no clear conclusion. One officer walked the mountainside edge for several minutes to rule out a vehicle having gone low, but visibility was good. No slide marks, no depressed earth, no glinting metal below. That eliminated the possibility of a plunge, at least nearby. They spent a few more minutes sweeping the surrounding area for anything at all. A piece of plastic, an oil stain, footprints, personal items a passenger might have dropped. But the pavement and shoulder were clean. Nothing matched Harold, Lydia, or Daniel. The scene remained a disjointed collection. Glass, skid mark, tire swerve. Enough to raise questions, but not enough to tell a story. Per procedure at the time, when a scene showed no injury or clear evidence, the team had to mark it for follow-up once more data came in from other sectors. 2 officers strung caution tape around the glass and skid area, then drove wooden stakes as markers. They used a film camera to photograph the stretch from 4 angles, wide view, into the curve, and close-ups of the skid and glass. They understood these images could be vital. Mountain weather could erase traces in hours. Before pulling away, one officer radioed, "No vehicle, no people, no blood, but this could be where something happened. Recommend recheck." Archer pinned Route 74 with a red marker on the map, officially making it a primary point of interest alongside the Whitmore cabin. As the patrol vehicle started up again and continued south, both officers shared the same unsettled feeling. The traces they'd just seen weren't enough to explain what happened, but they couldn't be dismissed. If it was just a normal traffic incident, why was there no follow-up debris or report? If it was something worse, why was no one left behind? There was no answer yet, but in the search grid spreading across Evergreen that morning, Route 74 had become a potential if deeply confusing piece of the chain of events. Police were still trying to assemble, clue by clue. Not long after the Route 74 team marked the broken glass site, a new call came over the radio that made Sergeant Archer sit up straight. The team searching Bear Creek Canyon reported spotting a light-colored Ford parked crookedly on the shoulder, a near-perfect match for the vehicle. Harold was driving when he left home that morning. This was the first direct lead on the couple, instantly making it a top priority. As the team approached, the car came into view in a narrow clearing along the mountain pass, nose angled slightly into the weeds, right front tire hugging the edge. The driver's door stood ajar as if Harold had stepped out in a hurry and hadn't fully closed. There were no signs of a heavy crash, headlights intact, body undented, no major scratches. Whatever happened, it wasn't a violent wreck at this spot. 2 officers peered through the windows. The interior was empty. No Harold, no Lydia. On the passenger seat sat Lydia's cloth bag, neatly placed, familiar yet alarming. Inside were handkerchiefs, colored pencils, a few personal items, but the sketchbook she'd carried when she left home was gone. In the back seat, Harold's jacket lay rolled up, nothing odd about it. The floor was clean, no dirt, no signs of a struggle. The most telling detail, no keys. Not in the ignition, not on the seat or floor mat. That meant Harold had deliberately turned off the engine and taken the keys with him. The stop was intentional, not due to breakdown or force. One officer opened the door for a closer look. Headlight switch off, plenty of fuel, no pry marks on the trunk, nothing appeared stolen. The team fanned out to search the surrounding area. A few faint footprints in the dirt were too muddled to identify. Mountain roads saw plenty of traffic. A patch of flattened grass led into the brush, suggesting someone had walked there, but the trail vanished quickly. No clear path, no distinctive prints, no evidence of a fight. One officer climbed partway down the slope to rule out a fall, but the low hillside showed no tire slides, no churned earth, no foreign objects. That eliminated the idea Harold had driven off or someone had been dragged down. The car and surroundings were unnervingly tidy. If Harold and Lydia had left under duress, there should have been some sign. If they'd met someone, there should have been disturbance or dropped items. Instead, everything was orderly, quiet, as if they had simply parked and walked away, leaving no hint of where. When the report reached command, Archer drew a large circle around the car's location on the map. At this point, it was the clearest link to Harold and Lydia. Where the Whitmore cabin raised alarm, the abandoned Ford gave a different feeling. Not chaos, but unnatural silence, as if its owners had vanished in an instant without resistance. The team took film photographs from every angle: the car's position, distance to the edge, open door, Lydia's bag, jacket and back. They logged the faint footprints even if their value was unclear. Every detail went into the notebook: the direction the car faced, tire condition, open door, remaining belongings. Before leaving, one officer spoke quietly into the radio beside the car. "Parking here and just walking off. Something's way off." It was the first verbal acknowledgement that morning of what everyone was thinking. This wasn't looking like an interrupted trip anymore. It was starting to feel like something far stranger. No bodies, no solid evidence, no idea what had happened. But the abandoned Ford, clean, deliberate, and utterly silent, had pushed police toward suspecting they weren't just searching for missing persons, but standing at the first real sign of something far more serious. When the information about the abandoned Ford was confirmed, Sergeant Archer immediately shifted his attention back to the Whitmore cabin, the only location so far that showed any sign Daniel and baby Benjamin had been present before vanishing. The details the patrol team had initially noted: items lightly knocked over on the porch, fresh tire tracks, unusual lights the night before, all made the cabin the spot that needed an interior search as soon as possible. The patrol team returned to the cabin again, this time with a clear objective: get inside and determine whether anyone needed emergency help. They shouted Daniel's name several times, pounded hard on the wooden door, but the cabin stayed dead silent, like it had been abandoned for years. When there was no response, Archer ordered the door forced open according to procedure. One officer slammed the butt of his flashlight into the lock. On the third blow, the door flew open, letting the early sunlight spill into the dark room. Stepping over the threshold, they immediately realized the cabin was not in a normal state. It wasn't total chaos, but something had clearly interrupted life here. Baby Benjamin's crib was slightly pushed away from the corner wall, as if someone had shoved it hard or bumped into it. Next to it, a baby blanket was lightly balled up on the floor, and an empty glass bottle lay on its side nearby. Those small details made it hard for the patrol to judge how rushed Daniel's departure from the cabin had been, or what exactly had happened before they left. The small kitchen table was just as telling. 2 bowls still held half-eaten food, crumbs of bread and some cold oatmeal. One bowl sat crooked near the edge of the table, a spoon lying beneath it on the floor. On the chair nearest the table, Daniel's jacket was draped carelessly, as if he'd dropped it mid-motion while putting it on. All of it combined to give the feeling that daily life inside the cabin had stopped dead in its track. The patrol split up to check the smaller areas: the bedroom near the back door, the sink, the kitchen corner, and the storage closet. Nowhere showed clear signs of a struggle. No blood, no deep scratches on the floor, no furniture thrown around. But there was also no trace of Daniel or baby Benjamin being in the cabin at the time of the search. The diaper bag and baby supplies Margaret swore Daniel always carried were nowhere to be found. Everything essential for a months-old infant appeared to have been taken when they left the cabin. One officer noticed a faint dirt smudge near the back door, not a clear footprint, but enough to suggest the door had been opened and someone had stepped out before the ground soaked up the moisture again. When they pushed the back door open to check, a rush of cold pine-scented air poured in, making the cabin feel even more desolate. Outside, the ground showed a shallow trail leading into the woods, one of the occasional footpaths locals use. The fresh tire tracks discovered that morning weren't far from this path either. That suggested Daniel might have driven away from the cabin using the back door, not the front. One officer bent down to examine the small rug near the crib. It was pulled askew but not enough to say someone had yanked it hard. Details like that sat in a gray area, strange enough to notice, but not enough to call it evidence of violence or a fight. Once every corner had been checked, the patrol regrouped in the main room and paused to quickly sum up what they'd seen. The cabin showed no signs of a brawl, yet it also didn't look like a place someone had left calmly. Everything felt abandoned mid-task: half-eaten meals, feeding the baby, putting on a jacket, but whatever happened had forced them to leave before finishing. The report sent back to Archer made him mark the Whitmore cabin with the highest priority. The cabin showed disturbance but no proof of a crime. The only thing clear was that Daniel and baby Benjamin had left. No idea in which direction, in what condition or why. With Harold's Ford abandoned nearby and the broken glass on Route 74 still unexplained, the cabin became the third piece in a puzzle whose shape was still unknown for the 2 disappearances. What made the case more complicated was that there was no overlap between the 3 scenes. Whitmore cabin, where Daniel disappeared with baby Benjamin. Route 74, where there were skid marks and broken glass, but no vehicle. The location of Harold's Ford, where both Harold and Lydia had vanished. None of the pieces matched. No evidence Daniel ever met Harold or Lydia. None of Lydia's belongings showed up in the cabin. No trace of Daniel's car on Route 74 at the time it was found. Each scene pointed in a different direction. At that moment, every officer standing outside the Whitmore cabin shared the same feeling. They were no longer just looking for people who got lost or left home without telling anyone. Every area they approached was too quiet, too neat, and missing the exact pieces of information needed to understand what had happened. Evergreen had only just stepped into noon, but the search had already shifted from routine to deeply suspicious, and the Whitmore cabin, with its eerie silence, had become the center of the biggest question of the day. When the patrol left the Whitmore cabin and reported everything they'd found, Sergeant Archer ordered everyone to stop and pool the data. This was the moment he expected the picture to finally start coming together after a tense morning of search. But when the notes, film photos, and reports were laid out on the table, the problem revealed itself in the most frustrating way possible. The three scenes, Whitmore cabin, Route 74 and the abandoned Ford, had no point of intersection. Archer stood in front of the map, stuck 3 large pins in 3 separate locations, then tried connecting them with a pencil. It wasn't 3 segments forming a coherent line. It was 3 isolated dots with no obvious logic linking them. Everything pointed to the fact that what they had weren't 3 parts of one incident, but 3 unfinished stories, each missing half the page. Scene 1. Whitmore cabin. The cabin showed disturbance but no evidence of violence. The crib pushed aside, half-finished meals on the table, Daniel's jacket left behind, empty bottle on the floor. Every detail pointed to life being interrupted, but none explained why. No blood, nothing dropped in chaos. No sign of forced entry or a second person present. Most importantly, no clue as to which way Daniel and the baby had left. The fresh tire tracks weren't clear enough to show direction, and the slightly open back door only proved someone had gone outside. Nothing more. The cabin was a starting point, but it didn't lead anywhere else. Scene 2. Route 74. Broken glass and long curving skid marks were the only things that made this stretch of road suspicious. But everything else was empty. No car, no victims, no sign of a heavy crash, no identifying item. The skid marks showed a moment of hard braking, but not who braked or why. The glass was so clean it was impossible to tell what kind of headlight it came from. The scene hinted at an incident, but not enough to say whether it involved Harold, Lydia, Daniel or someone else entirely. Scene 3. Harold's Ford. The car sat intact on the shoulder. Driver's door cracked open a little. Lydia's purse still inside, Harold's coat on the back seat. No blood, no struggle, nothing dropped, no drag marks, no clear footprints leading away. Everything inside the car suggested Harold and Lydia had willingly turned off the engine and stepped out, but they never came back. And around the car there was no indication which way they went or who, if anyone. When Archer laid the 3 scenes side by side, he tried to see if clues from one talked to another, but nothing from the cabin appeared on Route 74. None of Lydia's or Harold's belongings showed up in the cabin. No sign Daniel had ever passed the Ford's location. No witnesses saw them meet each other or a stranger. No matching tire tracks between the 3 sites. No overlapping timeline between the 3 events. Even the timeline, usually the easiest tool to cut through ambiguity, failed completely. Daniel left the cabin sometime before dawn. Harold and Lydia left home while it was still dim. There was no way to pinpoint when the glass fell on Route 74. The Ford had been abandoned within the last few hours, but the exact time was unclear. Every timestamp was off. None formed a logical sequence. A young officer asked, could they have met somewhere on the road we don't know about yet? Archer shook his head. No evidence. Another suggested combining all 3 into one investigation file. Archer shook his head again. No legal ground. In the 1960s, police couldn't merge 2 separate missing persons cases into one combined investigation without direct evidence. Instinct didn't count as grounds. All they could do was classify based on what was proven, not what felt strange. The final conclusion, even though Archer hated it, had to be written in the report. 2 independent missing persons cases. 1 Daniel and baby Benjamin. 2 Harold and Lydia. Route 74 was noted as a point to monitor but not yet attached to either case. That afternoon, when the end-of-day report was signed, Archer stared at the map again. He knew the way the case was being classified could make future investigation far harder. When the pieces were separated from the start, the odds of ever putting them back together dropped sharply. But with what they had, no hard evidence, no witnesses, No physical traces. It was the only way they could proceed. None of them imagined that decision would lay the foundation for years of stagnation. From 3 vague scenes they stepped into 2 separate investigations, and that separation was the seed that let the case slowly fall silent and turn into a decades-long cold file. When the consolidated report on the 3 disconnected scenes reached the commander's desk, Sergeant Archer knew they had to widen the search immediately. From the abandoned Ford, he sent 2 teams down the south slope of Route 74, the area they'd only glanced at that morning when fog was thick and visibility poor. If anything had been missed, it would be down there. And just as Archer's gut told him, that was exactly where the case's turning point appeared. Late afternoon in the Evergreen Mountains, the light was fading fast, only a few slanting rays cutting through the pines. A 2-man patrol was working along the edge of the drop, when one suddenly stopped. Among the golden-brown pine needles was a patch of color that didn't belong, brighter, unnatural. He signaled his partner, then moved to the edge of the small ravine. As they got closer, they saw it wasn't rock and it wasn't trash. It was part of a human body. The radio crackled at once. Possible human remains sighted. Need backup now. Archer told them to hold position and touch nothing. Minutes later, 3 more officers arrived, using sticks to clear a path down to the lower ground. The crevice wasn't deep, just a natural dip between 2 rock shelves, but narrow enough to stay hidden from the road above. When the team reached the bottom, the scene became clear. The first body lay higher up the slope on its side facing downhill. The right arm was folded under the torso, left leg straight, clothing intact. The position looked still, with no sign of a long fall or roll. It appeared the person had simply fallen or been pushed from the grassy edge above. A few meters away, the second body lay on its back, head turned left arm slightly out. The thin layer of pine needles showed minor disturbance, but nothing suggesting a fierce struggle. This person's clothing was also intact. No tears, no major disarray, no personal items around either body, no wallet, no purse, no ID. Even though the patrol followed procedure to the letter, everyone knew they were looking at Harold and Lydia. 2 bodies only a few steps apart in the same narrow ravine. Both lying peacefully, there was no doubt. One officer spoke into the radio, voice low. Confirmed. 2 bodies. Extremely likely Harold and Lydia. Archer froze for a few seconds when he heard it. Ever since the Ford had been found empty on the mountainside, he'd feared the worst, but finding both bodies so close together made one thing crystal clear. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a criminal homicide. When the investigation team arrived, they began documenting the scene meticulously, but exactly as Archer ordered. No speculation on cause of death, no assumptions about injuries, no forensic conclusions. At this stage, the job was only to describe positions accurately. First body on its side, second body on its back, distance between the 2 bodies, slope angle of the area, layer of pine needles, dirt and rock around them, direction the faces pointed, position of limbs, condition of clothing, just those details, nothing more. What troubled Archer most when he looked at the quick film photos from the scene was the inconsistency between the 2 positions. If Harold and Lydia had both slipped and fallen, the odds were higher they'd end up close together in similar poses. But here, their positions felt like they had gone over separately, at different moments, or from different angles. The team swept the surrounding thick layer of pine needles. No drag marks, no deep skid trails, no branches broken by heavy impact. Everything indicated the bodies were lying exactly where the 2 had died, not moved from somewhere else. As the bodies were lifted out of the ravine, the investigators widened the search radius, but the larger area yielded nothing useful. No fresh tire tracks, no glass fragments matching Route 74, no personal items, no clear sign a third person had left the scene in any particular direction. Archer placed a red pin on the map marking where Harold and Lydia were found. The moment he set it down, he realized something heavy. That pin had just shattered the original investigation structure, turning the case from parallel disappearances into a murder investigation with no known killer, no known motive, and no known sequence of events. The strangest, most unsettling part was that the death scene explained nothing about the Whitmore cabin. If Harold and Lydia had been killed in this ravine, then why did the cabin show signs of Daniel's interrupted life? Why were there hard-breaking skid marks on Route 70? Why was the fort abandoned so far from the bodies? And biggest of all, where were Daniel and baby Benjamin? There was no physical evidence at the ravine that Daniel had ever been there. No sign of a child. None of the cabin's items. No matching tire tracks. No unusual footprints. No indication Harold and Lydia had ever gone near the cabin area. The case didn't just fail to get clearer, it veered off completely. One disappearance had officially become a double homicide, but it only solved exactly 1/3 of the story. The rest, Daniel, baby Benjamin, the cabin, Route 74, remained shrouded in fog. As night fell, Archer knew the only thing he could write in that night's report: Harold and Lydia located deceased, suspected homicide. No direct link to the disappearance of Daniel and baby Benjamin. And that seemingly routine concluding line was the very thing that sent the case down a path everyone would later recognize, an investigation that grew more branches the deeper they dug, more mysteries, fewer connections, a case with no answer, and one that was step by step becoming one of the toughest cold cases Evergreen had ever seen. Right after the bodies of Harold and Lydia were removed from the ravine, the search teams expanded their sweep to every trail branching off the eastern woods beyond the Whitmore cabin. Sergeant Archer knew that, with both adults now confirmed dead, little Benjamin had just become the absolute priority. The cabin made it clear Daniel had left with the child, yet no trail led them out of the forest. Every path, no matter how faint, had to be checked. A three-man team followed a narrow trail they had only skimmed that morning because of poor light. The thick pine canopy killed the late afternoon sun fast, turning everything dim. A few dozen yards in, one officer suddenly stopped and pointed at something pale flickering through the dry needles, something white down there, not a rock. They moved in, crouched, and instantly recognized what nobody wanted to see: the body of a small child lying on its side right at the edge of the trail. The radio cracked immediately: possible body of Benjamin located. Send investigators. The area around the body was taped off at once. They didn't touch the child, only brushed away leaves gently to expose the ground beneath. The boy lay in a natural position, as if asleep, clothes intact, left hand near his chest, right hand resting on the pine needles. No blood, no obvious bruise, nothing around the body, no blanket, no bottle, no diaper bag. One officer whispered, voice tight, looks placed, not fallen. Nobody answered, but everyone thought the same. The needles underneath were only slightly depressed, enough to show the body hadn't been there long, but not so fresh that wind had already scattered them. Most important, no drag marks, no furrows, no scuff marks leading to the spot. The scene felt unnaturally still. When the investigators arrived, they documented every detail: angle of the body, direction of the head and limbs, distance from the trail to the tree line, layer of needles, tree trunks and broken branches nearby, old, undated footprints from hikers. No one offered a forensic theory on site. Protocol left that to the experts, but every officer understood the boy's death showed no signs of accident. When Archer reached the scene, daylight was almost gone. He stood several yards back, taking in the whole trail. The child lay in a spot not hard to miss yet hidden enough that someone moving fast could walk right past. No signs of struggle, no signs of flight, nothing dropped. An unnaturally clean scene. What weighed heaviest on Archer was the location itself. Not the cabin, not Route 74, not near where Harold and Lydia were found. This was a completely separate third site, opening yet another branch in an already tangled case. He jotted quick notes. Cabin, Daniel and child left. Direction unknown. Route 74, skid marks, broken glass, no bodies. Harold's Ford, abandoned, clean. Ravine, Harold and Lydia dead. Trail, Benjamin dead. 5 points, 5 pieces, none of them talking to the other. When the investigators finished photos and measurements, Archer ordered the search widened another 200 yards in every direction, hoping for footprints, tire tracks, anything tied to Daniel. The forest gave its usual answer: total silence. No tire tracks. No children's item. No footprints leading away from the trail. No papers or personal effects. Nothing linking Benjamin's body to the cabin or to where Harold and Lydia were found. As night fell over Evergreen, Archer wrote the final line of the evening report. Body of Benjamin located on Eastern Trail. Independent scene. No evidence connecting to prior 2 death scenes. In a single day, search teams had recovered 3 bodies at 3 unconnected locations, with no common logic, and no clues suggesting they belonged to the same chain of events. That absolute separation pushed the case from complicated to opaque. The start of 5 months that Evergreen would later know by only one name, a case with no entrance and no exit, a structural cold case. Night settled over Evergreen, as the entire investigation team was called back to the temporary headquarters near Route 74. Nobody spoke much. The air was heavy from finding 3 bodies in 3 separate places in one day. Sergeant Archer stood in front of the big board, wrote the 4 names, Harold, Lydia, Benjamin, and Daniel, then drew columns to compile one last time every known movement and fact. As reports came in one by one, something became painfully clear and silenced the room. Every piece of information pointed straight at Daniel Whitmore. The cabin proved he was the last person to leave with Benjamin. The crib askew, meal half-eaten, coat left behind, back door open. No sign of any stranger. Yet the cabin's total silence only reinforced that Daniel had actively taken the child and left. And when Benjamin's body was found on the Eastern Trail, the boy's death became the only endpoint of a route Daniel could have walked. By contrast, Harold and Lydia's bodies in the ravine showed no link to the cabin or to anything child-related. Harold's abandoned Ford bore no evidence Daniel had ever been near it. That meant 2 completely separate paths, one for Daniel, one for Harold and Lydia, and that separation made Daniel's disappearance look far more suspicious. Archer circled Daniel's name as every data point lined up. Daniel was the only one of the 4 still alive, the only one who could move freely when everything happened, the only one without an alibi, the only one known to have been with the youngest victim before the child turned up dead. No one dared say outright that Daniel was the killer, but every logical thread placed him at the center of the map. One officer floated the idea that maybe Harold and Lydia had run into Daniel in the woods and tragedy followed. Archer shot it down. There wasn't a shred of evidence they ever crossed paths. The next questions had no answers. If Daniel didn't kill Harold and Lydia, then who did? And if he didn't kill Benjamin, why was the child's body placed in a completely isolated spot? Those questions, instead of reducing suspicion, only tightened the focus on Daniel. At the end of the meeting, the lead investigator stated firmly, "We can't say Daniel is the perpetrator, but Daniel is the only person capable of causing the deaths of the other 3. Archer wrote the final line on the board. Daniel Whitmore, prime suspect. Pursuit not search. No one objected. No one put another name forward. From that moment, Daniel was no longer just the last missing person. He became the figure holding the key to the entire case. The only one who could explain 3 disconnected scenes, 3 mysterious mystias, and a chain of events that refused to connect in Evergreen. Word of the Ford Fairlane came just as headquarters wrapped up the meeting, naming Daniel the prime suspect. An inter-county patrol reported spotting a light blue car abandoned on the outskirts of Idaho Springs, next to an old warehouse right off the mountain road. Color and model matched Daniel's, so Sergeant Archer headed out immediately with 2 officers. When they arrived, the Fairlane sat tight against the warehouse wall, motionless in the dark, as if deliberately placed there. A thin layer of dust on the hood showed the car had only been there a few hours. Doors locked. No pry marks. Shining flashlights through the windows revealed an unnaturally empty interior. No coat, no diaper bag, no papers, nothing you'd expect from someone traveling with an infant. When they popped the locks, the inside was even barer. No map, no note, no bottle, no food. An absolute void. The key was gone too. Archer checked the driver's seat and saw it was still pulled back exactly the way Daniel liked it. Proof he had driven the car here. But the floor was clean. No dirt, no shoe prints, no struggle marks. Glove box empty. Trunk held only a few old tools. No blanket, nothing belonging to Benjamin. That strengthened the theory that the child's body had never been transported in the Fairlane. Even stranger, no fresh footprints around the car. Idaho Springs soil was softer than Evergreen's. Stand still for a minute and you left a print. Yet nothing. No Daniel's shoes, no anyone's. No drag marks. Nothing dropped. No clue which way he went. It was as if he opened the door, stepped out, and vanished into thin air. One officer walked the road edge. No pedestrian tracks. Another checked under the chassis with a flashlight. Nothing. The absence of footprints led to only one conclusion. Daniel had not left the area on foot. Idaho Springs sat right on the federal truck road, and only a few miles from a bus stop. Archer instantly saw the most likely escape. Daniel could have flagged down a long-haul truck, caught a bus toward Denver, or hitched any ride that stopped. Perfect ways to leave Colorado without a trace. The local Idaho Springs team confirmed plenty of truckers stopped at nearby rest areas that day. No one remembered picking anyone up, but they also admitted hitchhikers were common on mountain runs. No sign-in logs, no cameras, no night staff. In 1963, tracing someone who ditched a car and thumbed a ride was nearly impossible. Archer circled the Fairlane one last time. He felt clearly that the car wasn't a scene of violence, it was a scene of flight. Daniel left no papers to track him, no personal items, no hint of state of mind or intent. He did only one thing: drove as far from Evergreen as needed, parked in a convenient spot, then disappeared in a direction completely detached from the case. When forensics lifted prints, the results made everything worse. Only Daniel's fingerprints inside. No sign anyone else had ever ridden with him. That both raised the odds he fled alone, and made it harder for police to tell whether he was escaping or had himself become a victim somewhere outside Colorado. One officer blurted, "He's out of state by now, I'd bet on it." Archer didn't answer, but he knew it was almost certainly true. The Fairlane was the last solid thread they had. Beyond Idaho Springs the road split dozens of ways: Denver, Kansas, Utah, Wyoming. Daniel could have caught anything. Just a few hours after leaving Idaho Springs, he could be completely clear of Colorado. Back at temporary headquarters, Archer wrote the short, heavy closing line on the report: Daniel Whitmore's Fairlane located in Idaho Springs. No traces, no papers, no body. High probability suspect has left the state. With that discovery, every search effort inside Evergreen became pointless. The investigation was no longer confined to one small town. It had spread into a nationwide manhunt along every interstate route. The case wasn't just more complicated, it had entered its darkest phase. The only person who could explain 3 deaths had vanished from Colorado, leaving behind a maze with no way out. After the Fairlane abandoned in Idaho Springs was recovered, police hoped it would be the key to unlocking a new investigative direction. But within just a few weeks, all that hope evaporated. The car bore no strange fingerprints, no documents, nothing belonging to little Benjamin or the Whitmore cabin. Every fingerprint recovered belonged to Daniel, something that was utterly useless. In 1963, with no national database, no automated fingerprint matching system, and every process relying on paper records mailed back and forth, manually comparing hundreds of print sets led to only one conclusion: no matches with any known criminal. In the first month, the investigative team still tried to maintain the pace of the search. They went door to door at every motel, gas station and truck stop along the Evergreen Idaho Springs route. They questioned long-haul truckers, roadside diner owners, and bus passengers. But the answers were always the same. Didn't see anyone like that. Don't remember anyone hitchhiking. Not sure. In an era without security cameras, passenger logs, or highway surveillance, tracking a healthy adult who left town on foot or by thumbing a ride was practically impossible. By the second month, the search expanded to neighboring towns, and even bordering states. Police departments in Wyoming, Utah, and Kansas all received Daniel's description: male, late 20s, brown hair, slim build. A few possible sightings were reported back to Evergreen, but when checked, none matched. No bank transactions from Daniel, no letters, no hotel registrations, no job applications. Daniel had simply vanished into thin air the moment he abandoned the car in Idaho Springs. Search efforts in the Evergreen forest also reached a dead end. Local teams repeatedly returned to the Whitmore cabin, Route 74, the ravine where Harold and Lydia were found, and the trail where Benjamin's body was discovered. They looked for fresh footprints, discarded items, anything Daniel might have accidentally left behind, but there was nothing. Not a scrap of cloth, not a cigarette butt, not a single scuff mark on the pine needles. The 3 crime scenes had been disconnected from the start, and the more they searched, the more absolute that separation appeared. By the end of 1963, the investigation had shrunk to periodic meetings whose content was almost identical. No new leads. Police tried reconstructing the timeline multiple times, but always hit the same problem. The cabin wasn't connected to Route 74. Route 74 wasn't connected to the ravine. The ravine wasn't connected to the trail. The trail wasn't connected to Idaho Springs. And Daniel, the central figure in every suspicion, was the only person who left no clear trail of movement. In early 1964, the state agency stepped in to review the entire file for any federal element that would allow the case to be handed to the FBI. But the response sent back to Evergreen was brief. No evidence Daniel crossed state lines. No basis for federal jurisdiction. When they didn't know how Daniel left Colorado, when he left or whether he even left at all, the case didn't qualify for broader investigation. By late 1964, the media had stopped mentioning the case. The town of Evergreen slowly returned to normal life. In the investigation room, only Archer and a few persistent officers remained, poring over the same photos and notes again and again, but nothing led to any new conclusion. Daniel remained the prime suspect and at the same time, a missing person, no body, no confession, no evidence to charge him. Every theory fell into a void. In 1965 there were no more calls from other states reporting someone who looked like Daniel, no unidentified bodies matching his description, no strangers appearing in the area, no additional physical evidence found in the Evergreen forest. The case was so stagnant that for an entire year, the file was only updated with a few reports, all containing the same phrase, "Nothing new to report." Finally, in mid-1965, Archer made the decision he had been putting off for months. Move the file to the cold case storage. On a quiet afternoon, all the documents were gathered into one thick folder, bound in a silver-gray hardcover, and labeled Evergreen. The case was officially frozen, not because the police gave up, but because the technology of that era had no tool powerful enough to move them forward even one more step. And from that day on, the name Daniel Whitmore no longer appeared in any news report, any official document, or any statement. He had disappeared completely. When the Evergreen file was moved to cold case storage in 1965, no one imagined that the evidence sealed inside those old metal boxes would become the key to solving the case 60 years later. At the time, the police were simply following minimum protocol: seal it, number it, store it. But that very simplicity, never destroying it, never repurposing it, never opening the boxes, accidentally preserved everything almost perfectly through the decade. Immediately after the case was frozen, Sergeant Archer created an evidence inventory and ordered it stored in the department's industrial steel cabinets. The inventory included Benjamin's baby coat, spent casings, and bullet fragments collected near the ravine where Harold and Lydia were found. Crime scene film photos of the cabin, Route 74, the ravine, and the trail, items from the cabin, including a child's blanket, half-eaten dishes, Daniel's handwritten note, glass fragments from Route 74, and soil pine needle samples taken around Harold and Lydia's bodies. At the time, most of these items had no investigative value, no DNA, no trace evidence analysis, no ballistic tracing technology. Yet Archer kept everything, true to the motto he always repeated: evidence that entered the case has to live with the case. Evergreen's evidence storage procedures, though primitive, proved remarkably effective. The child's garment was wrapped in medical paper and placed in an airtight metal box, so it never mildewed, despite the decades. The casings were kept in separate containers and suffered minimal oxidation. The black and white photographs were hand-developed, sleeved in plastic, and never faded. Cabin items like the blanket and dishes were individually wrapped in craft paper bags to prevent cross-contamination. Nothing was lost or repurposed, an unusually rare outcome when many departments of that era routinely cleared storage space or reused old evidence for training. Evergreen also happened to have one major advantage: a dry, cold basement and sealed steel cabinets, originally purchased for budget records. When repurposed for evidence, they created a stable environment, no direct light, no humidity, ideal for preserving fabric, paper, and metal. A small town with few murders meant the evidence locker never faced pressure to free up space like larger departments. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, while many law enforcement agencies nationwide began destroying old evidence, Evergreen did not because they were forward-thinking, but because they had no reason to touch those boxes. The 1963 Evergreen case was the most serious crime in the town's history, and even though the investigation had stalled, every subsequent chief honored Archer's instruction. Do not destroy anything. That stubborn conservatism, once seen as outdated, became the very thing that protected the evidence from human hands for decades. When technology began advancing in the late 1990s and early 2000s, many departments sent old evidence for retesting. Evergreen lacked the budget to do so, but that delay kept the evidence from being mishandled or lost. During a 2002 inventory, a young officer noted that the Evergreen divan was in astonishingly pristine condition. No one yet understood why that mattered, until trace evidence analysis and faded fingerprint recovery techniques emerged. Experts later agreed, had the Evergreen evidence suffered moisture decay, cross-contamination or loss in just one of those 6 decades, the case could never have been reopened. But because it stayed in steel cabinets rarely moved and barely touched, every item from Benjamin's little coat to the crime scene photos to the spent casings remained in near original condition. No one in 1965 could have guessed that those small objects would become the key to solving the case, but they, and their near-perfect preservation, allowed a later generation to reopen a door everyone thought was locked forever. The case slept for 60 years, but the evidence did not. It was preserved perfectly, quietly waiting for technology to catch up. And that changed everything. After more than half a century gathering dust in cold case storage, the 1963 Evergreen case suddenly drew attention again when Denver's cold case unit launched a program to review unsolved cases. Before a key criterion, the case had to have physical evidence still capable of yielding modern DNA, and when the Evergreen evidence inventory was opened, Benjamin's baby coat, the item that had sat in a steel cabinet since 1963, immediately stood out. No rot, no mold, no discoloration. The Denver investigators could hardly believe their eyes. This was the oldest piece of evidence they had ever seen in such pristine condition. In April 2018, the coat was transported to the Denver DNA lab. Because clothing from that era wasn't collected with anti-contamination standards, technicians had to examine it centimeter by centimeter under low-intensity light to locate microscopic biological traces. After hours of work, they located a very small amount of DNA, but enough to begin extraction. That was the critical first step. If the coat had yielded no biological material, the entire program would have ended there. The sample was amplified using PCR and run through next-generation sequencing, capable of building a profile from minuscule amounts of material. The result was an incomplete genetic profile, but with sufficient SNPs, the gene segments used for genealogical comparison. That meant the sample could be uploaded to a genetic genealogy database. The lab confirmed, not perfect, but above threshold. The question now was, whose DNA was it? Daniel had never been arrested, had no biometric record, no reference sample. Direct identification was impossible. Only one path remained: locate distant relatives and work backward. This was a new technique that had already cracked several decades-old cold cases. Now Evergreen became one of the cases selected for the experiment. In June 2018, the DNA profile from Benjamin's coat was uploaded to the genealogy database. Algorithms began running, comparing thousands of genomes, looking for small segment matches, identifying fourth and quinto cousin level relatives. The system didn't return a suspect, but it returned people who shared distant ancestry with the DNA on the coat. From those tiny matches, the genealogy team built a massive family tree, cross-referencing state records, birth and death certificates, immigration data, and family branches, splitting off since the late 19th century. One surname began to stand out among the branches: Whitmore. By late July, the experts issued a preliminary finding. The DNA recovered from Benjamin's coat has a very high probability of belonging to a member of the Whitmore family, and is almost certainly a first-degree relative of Daniel. That meant the DNA could be Daniel's, or it could belong to someone extremely closely related to him. It wasn't the final answer yet, but it was the strongest lead in over half a century. For the first time, Evergreen had a clue that wasn't speculation, a scientific lead that could be followed. The meeting in Denver that day was recorded in the minutes with a single sentence: Evergreen case, probability of reverse genealogy identification, very high. For the new generation of investigators, this was a technical breakthrough, but for Evergreen, a town that once stood before 3 unsolved bodies. This was the first time in 55 years that the darkness of the case let in a sliver of light. Benjamin's little coat had waited in a steel cabinet since 1963 for the right era to speak what it knew, and in 2000, when the DNA profile from baby Benjamin's jacket was uploaded into the genealogy database and immediately returned strong hits linked to the Whitmore family branch, the Denver investigators knew they had entered the most critical phase of the case. The genetic system continuously filtered and grouped distant relatives. After multiple rounds of comparison, one small branch of the Whitmore family stood out as an anomaly, a cluster of relatives who had moved to Arizona in the late. Among them, the name Walter Price, a man born in 1933, living in Kingman, Arizona, immediately caught the team's attention. This man's records only existed from 1978 onward. There was nothing before that, no old driver's license, no federal tax records, no property registration in any state. A human being who essentially appeared out of nowhere. But more importantly, Price's genetic markers matched numerous S&P segments from the profile taken from Benjamin's jacket, far exceeding the level of a typical distant relative. This suggested that Walter Price was either Daniel himself or an extremely close blood relative. To verify, Denver's cold case unit sent a request to Arizona asking whether Walter Price had fingerprints on file. After 3 weeks of searching, the Arizona Department of Public Safety returned a 1982 record. Walter Price had applied for a temporary work permit and provided all 10 fingerprints. The moment the data arrived in Denver, technicians compared it directly to the faint fingerprint recovered from the Whitmore cabin doorknob in 1963. A print that had previously been considered useless because it was too smudged for old technology. In seconds, the screen flashed the result. Fingerprints match 100. No error rate, no debate. The print found on the cabin knob in 1163 belonged to Walter Price, and that left only one possible explanation. Walter Price was Daniel Whitmore living under an assumed identity. The conference room went silent. After more than half a century of searching, the missing suspect had finally resurfaced, not in the Evergreen forest, not buried under Route 74, but in the Arizona desert, quietly living under a name that wasn't his. Denver immediately launched a deeper background check. How did Price get to Arizona? Did anyone know he had moved from somewhere else? Was there any criminal history attached to him? The first trace appeared in Kingman City records. Price rented a small motel room in 1978, paid cash, listed his birth year as 9. 2 years later he moved into an old wooden house on the town's outskirts. He lived alone, never married, no children, no long-term medical records, no income tax filings. Everything matched the profile of someone trying to erase his past. Local Kingman investigators who were interviewed described him as a quiet old man, kept to himself and never talked about his life before. That was enough for the Evergreen team to understand that Daniel had not died in 1963. He had abandoned everything in Colorado, built a new life in Arizona, and hidden in plain sight for decades. When Denver examined the claimed birth year, they noticed Price listed 1930. Falsifying age was extremely easy in the 1970s. No federal databases, no biometric cross-checks, and many localities accepted verbal birth declarations for work permits or residency cards. This further confirmed that Price was a fabricated identity designed to conceal the real one. After the fingerprint analysis was finalized, Denver scheduled an emergency meeting to prepare an arrest warrant for Daniel Whitmore, then believed to be living in Kingman, Arizona, at approximately age. But just as the paperwork was nearly complete, a phone call from the Kingman Police Department caused the Denver room to fall so quiet you could hear a pen drop. Walter Price had died of heart failure 1 week earlier. No relatives came to claim the body. No funeral. No one in his 40 years in Arizona knew who he really was, and that silence said everything. Even though the suspect was dead, the new evidence, DNA genealogy, fingerprints had played the decisive role in confirming his true identity. For the first time in 55 years, the Evergreen case finally had a clear name. Daniel Whitmore, the man who vanished in 1963, had actually lived out his life as Walter Price, but the most important question remained. If Daniel lived another 55 years, was he the killer, or simply the last survivor? After confirming Walter Price was Daniel Whitmore through fingerprints and genetic genealogy, Denver immediately moved to the next phase, seizing all property, personal belongings, and anything that could reconstruct the truth of. Even though Daniel was deceased, the procedure was carried out as if apprehending a living suspect to ensure every piece of evidence was legally preserved. Arizona police reported that Price had spent his final 2 years in a nursing home in Tucson. His belongings were still in his room, unclaimed, because he had no listed family. One morning in November 2018, the Denver investigative team entered Sunset Palms Senior Roar. Long hallways, dim yellow lights, silence so deep you could hear footsteps. They stopped at room 2B, the place Daniel spent his final days under the false name. When the door opened, the first thing everyone noticed was absolute order. Every item placed with rigid precision, echoing the 1963 psychological profile of Daniel Whitmore, a man obsessed with order and control. This alone confirmed they had the right person. In the nightstand drawer they found the first and most devastating piece of evidence, a silver necklace engraved, L.D., Lydia Dempsey, reported missing by the family in 1963. Never recovered. There was no innocent reason for a man in Arizona to possess Lydia's necklace, unless he was the last person she was with. It was the first direct physical link between Daniel and a victim. Beneath old wrapping paper lay a Colorado ID in the name of Daniel Whitmore. Original documents from the 1950s. Not destroyed, not altered. Clearly when he fled, he didn't discard his old identity, he hid. This revealed Daniel's inner conflict. He wanted to disappear yet couldn't fully let go of who he really was. Investigators opened the closet and pulled out a wooden box, secured with wire. Inside was what Evergreen had waited 55 years to see, a 1950s Smith & Wesson revolver and 2 old cartridges, same caliber as the casings found near Harold and Lydia's bodies. The condition of the wooden grip showed years of use. Ballistics couldn't confirm on site, but the probability that this was the gun present at the Route 74 ravine was extremely high. At the bottom of the closet was an old suitcase. Inside, clothes were folded exactly the way Daniel folded them in Evergreen. Shirt sleeves triple folded, pants single folded. A small detail that perfectly matched his known personality profile. Hidden at the very bottom was a notebook. The paper yellowed, the cover bearing only the letter D. When they opened it, everyone held their breath. It wasn't a full diary, just scattered personal notes, but among the shaky handwriting were lines that sent chills through the team. I didn't mean to do it. The little one was crying. The night was too long. I just wanted it all to stop. There's no going back. No names, no locations, but everyone knew these words referred to the night of night. For the first time, there existed a form of admission from Daniel himself. Vague, but enough to support the theory of criminal action. In a thin envelope next to the notebook was an old Polaroid, a young man standing in front of a log cabin, the Whitmore cabin, the back door crooked, matching the crime scene photos when police forced entry in. This photo proved Daniel either returned to or remained obsessed with the cabin years later, and may have physically revisited the scene in the early years of hiding. All items were sealed and transported to Denver. When the investigators reassembled everything, they were able for the first time in half a century to construct a complete 1963 timeline. Daniel leaves the Whitmore cabin with baby Benjamin in an unstable mental state. On Route 74, Harold and Lydia arrive at the same time, possibly trying to help or encountering Daniel by chance. An argument or violence erupts. Daniel fires the Smith & Wesson recovered in Tucson. Harold and Lydia fall into the ravine. Not an accident. Daniel carries Benjamin deeper into the woods and places the child on the eastern trail. No signs of accident. The baby died in a situation Daniel actively created by Daniel. Daniel flees in the Fairlane to Idaho Springs. From there he leaves Colorado, likely by truck or bus, assumes the name Walter Price, and lives quietly for nearly half a century. No major gaps remain to break the chain of logic. The evidence from Tucson filled every hole Evergreen couldn't solve. And Daniel Whitmore, the man who disappeared into the Evergreen Mountains that night, had carried the fragments of truth with him his entire life, and now the very items he kept exposed the whole story. The evidence collected from Room 2B in Tucson was transported to Denver under the strictest chain of custody protocols. In the lab, each item, the LD necklace, the Smith & Wesson, old casings, Daniel's real documents, the cabin Polaroid, the scattered notebook was examined separately, analyzed, then cross-referenced with the original and here, after nearly 60 years, science finally completed the picture that an entire generation of investigators had been powerless to see. First, fingerprints. The faint prints from the Whitmore cabin in 1963, once dismissed as unusable, were enhanced using modern digital algorithms. Compared to the 10-print card from Walter Price's 1982 work permit, the result was a 100% match across 3 separate samples, enough points of comparison to declare in court that the 24-year-old Daniel Whitmore of 1963 and the 85-year-old Walter Price of 2018 were the same person. Next, ballistics. The revolver recovered from Daniel's room was test-fired and compared to the 2 spent casings found at the ravine. The barrel's unique rifling characteristics, grooves and microscopic marks, matched the 1963 casings almost perfectly. The technicians wrote in the report, "No remaining doubt, this is the firearm present at the Route 74 crime scene." Then, the fragile DNA profile from Benjamin's 55-year-old jacket, preserved by pure chance, had already shown a first-degree relationship to the Whitmore line through genealogy. When compared to items from Price's nursing home room toothbrush razor, the DNA matched at every mark. Conclusion: the DNA on Benjamin's jacket belonged to Daniel Whitmore. Direct proof that Daniel was the last person holding the living child, and present immediately before the infant's death. The items from Daniel's room completed the picture. The LD necklace proved Daniel had contact with Harold and Lydia after they left home. The cabin Polaroid showed Daniel remained emotionally tied to or obsessed with the starting location. The notebook's fragmented entries did not detail actions, but admitted the emotions of the moment: panic, rage, loss of control, matching the theory that Daniel killed all 3 victims while mentally unstable. When everything was assembled, the cold case unit issued its final forensic conclusion: Daniel Whitmore is responsible for the deaths of Harold Dempsey, Lydia Dempsey, and Benjamin Whitmore. Although Daniel was dead, Colorado legal procedure still required the final step: public announcement of the findings. A small, solemn press conference was held in Denver at the end of no media circus, just quiet dignity. The PD representative stood at the podium and read a short statement. After 59 years of investigation, based on forensic DNA results, fingerprint analysis, ballistics comparison and evidence recovered in Arizona, the Colorado State Police officially closed the Evergreen. The sole suspect, Daniel Whitmore, has been fully identified as to identity and actions. No applause, only silence. The case had haunted an entire small mountain town. Now at last, it had reached its conclusion. Not through confession, but through science. A case deemed impossible in 1963 was solved thanks to 4 things that did not exist back then. Modern DNA capable of extracting a profile from a 55-year-old child's jacket. Genetic genealogy that located Daniel through distant cousin. Digital fingerprint enhancement that revived a smudged 1963 print. After the announcement, the Evergreen file was closed. This time not moved to cold storage, but permanently sealed with the final entry: case closed, solved, through forensic reconstruction. Through science, persistence and evidence that survived 6 decades, the truth was finally revealed. The Evergreen 1963 case is no longer a mystery. It has become proof. Sometimes justice arrives only when the era is advanced enough to hear what the past left behind. Looking at the Evergreen 1963 case in today's America, this story is not just a murder solved after nearly 60 years, it is a very concrete reminder of issues we still face: domestic violence, mental health, gun access, gaps in the justice system, and the value of forensic science. Daniel was a closed-off, control-obsessed, mentally unstable man whom no one truly intervened with. No psychological support, no warning system, something that looks very familiar in many modern American cases where red flags are seen but ignored or dismissed as private family business. Lydia's LD necklace in Daniel's drawer and the old Smith & Wesson he kept for decades show the danger when an unstable person has unsupervised access to firearms for years. The fact that baby Benjamin's body was found on a trail and his little jacket became the evidence that eventually broke the case offers another lesson: Every small detail, a bruise, a cry, a behavioral change, can be a signal a child is in danger, and neighbors teach, and the community must treat that as a shared responsibility, not only the families. On the system side, the fact that Evergreen PD preserved the jacket, crime scene photos and casings for 6 decades, and then used forensic DNA and digital fingerprint matching to solve it proves that investing in forensic science, evidence cold storage and cold case units, is not a luxury. It is how we tell victims and their families, the truth may come late, but we never give up. The practical lesson for every American today is do not ignore danger signs in families, do not downplay mental health, report anything unusual, and support scientific and legal efforts that protect the vulnerable, because the attitude of stay quiet and mind your own business is exactly what gave Daniel the chance to disappear for. Thank you for joining us to the very end of this case that seemed forever buried for almost 60 years. If the story made you think, please subscribe so you don't miss the next journeys to recover the truth. See you in the next video, where we will continue exploring mysteries that only time and justice can finally answer.